Welcome to EPG Pathshala's linguistics course. Within the morphology and syntax paper, for which I'm responsible, Prabal Dasgupta of the Indian Statistical Institute. In this session, we shall cover Module 20, called Pronouns and Anaphors. The objective of this module, as the name indicates, is to introduce you to the entire class of pronouns and focus especially on a subclass of pronouns which are called anaphors. Anaphor is a technical term of generative syntax. It is not in common use. So before we introduce the technical term, we need to remind you how the normal classification in the grammars that you have studied at school deals with the various subclasses of pronouns. The main type of pronoun that everybody thinks of the moment we use the word pronoun is what is called a personal pronoun. You've got personal pronouns chalked out into the first and second and third person. You've got first person pronouns I and we, second person pronouns thou and you, third person pronouns he, she, it and they in English, and similar words in other languages. These are the clearest example of pronouns and are what people think of when they hear pronouns mentioned. In addition, there are other subclasses of pronouns. You have, for example, reflexives, himself, herself, myself, yourself. You have reciprocals, each other, one another, and so on. You have relative pronouns, who, in a sentence like, the boy who met you yesterday is my brother. Who question mark, as in an interrogative. Who did you meet yesterday? The who without a question mark in the boy who you met yesterday is called a relative pronoun. The who with a question mark is called an interrogative pronoun. You have entire classes here. Interrogatives include who, which, where, when. Correspondingly, there are relatives without question marks, who, which, where, when. Then there are demonstratives like this and that. There is a lot of varieties of pronouns, as you can see. In this module, we shall deal mainly with anaphors, and within anaphors, we are going to first deal with reflexives and bound anaphors, and later we will turn to reciprocals. Sandwiched between the two, we will talk a little bit about personal pronouns for reasons that you will see as the module unfolds. We begin with defining the term anaphor. Those pronouns are called anaphors in generative syntax that are said to be anaphoric to an antecedent at an obligatory level. What is it to be anaphoric to an antecedent? You know what antecedents are. For example, if I say, John is not coming today, full stop, he is ill, full stop. You understand that the pronoun he takes John as its antecedent across a sentence boundary. You also know that something can take an antecedent within the same sentence, like John and his sister, where the word his takes John as its antecedent. Well, in generative syntax, we have a term corresponding to antecedent. The second element, which takes the first element as its antecedent, is called an element anaphoric to the antecedent. So to be anaphoric to something is to take that something as your antecedent. That is the adjective anaphoric. Now an anaphor, as in a noun, the word anaphor, an anaphor is an element which is always anaphoric. There are some elements that are part-time anaphoric, some elements that are full-time anaphoric. Anaphors are those which are full-time anaphoric. Reflexives, for example, have to have an antecedent. You cannot say himself is coming tomorrow. You have to say he shaved himself this morning, where himself takes he as the antecedent. Similarly, each other, which is a reciprocal pronoun, is always anaphoric. You can say John and Mary love each other, but you cannot say each other love John and Mary. Each other cannot work on its own. It has to take an antecedent. It must be anaphoric. Elements that must be anaphoric are called anaphors. Other elements can be anaphoric. They're part-time anaphoric, such as personal pronouns. So when you say John and his sister, the word his is a personal pronoun which takes John as its antecedent. That means his is anaphoric to John. However, that doesn't turn his into an anaphor in that structure. Why? Because John and his sister is in fact ambiguous between John and John's sister, and John and David's sister. Maybe there is some David that you've been talking about who is therefore salient in the discourse. So when you say John and his sister pointing at David, you mean John and David's sister. So there is no reason why his must take precisely John as its antecedent, or even anything in the sentence as its antecedent. It may refer to somebody else. Personal pronouns like he, she, it, they are therefore part-time anaphoric. They are not anaphoric all the time. That is why they are not counted as anaphors. But there's an exception to this. There are certain contexts in which even personal pronouns do get called anaphors. What are those contexts? For example, if you say Mary lost her way, Mary lost her way is not ambiguous between Mary losing Mary's way and Mary losing Susan's way. Mary lost her way must mean Mary lost Mary's way. There is no other meaning possible for that structure. These contexts in which personal pronouns must be anaphoric are called contexts of bound anaphora. Anaphora is the name of the phenomenon where something has to take an antecedent. It has to be anaphoric to that antecedent. That phenomenon is called anaphora. A bound anaphor is a personal pronoun in such a context where it has to be anaphoric, where it has no choice but to be anaphoric, for reasons to do with the construction. So you've got John craned his neck, Mary lost her way, Susan lost her temper. There are these special constructions in which bound anaphora occurs. So what have you got? You've got anaphor, a special technical term in generative grammar for words that are anaphoric all the time. And you've got a sub-classification of anaphors into 3 classes. Reflexives are always anaphors. Reciprocals, like each other, are always anaphors. And you've just heard about a 3rd subclass, personal pronouns in contexts of bound anaphora, where they count as bound anaphors. Those also are anaphors. So anaphors are of 3 types: reflexives, reciprocals, bound anaphors. Let us begin with reflexives. They're the clearest case. They're the case that everybody talks about first when you think of anaphora. There are 2 ways reflexives can occur in a sentence. Sometimes the reflexive is ordered by the verb. There is a verb that must take a reflexive. It cannot take any other kind of object. They're called reflexive verbs. There are other sentences where the reflexive just drops by to say hello. It's kind of a visitor. There is a legal technical term, perjury. When you employ the verb perjure, to perjure yourself is to take the stand as a witness in court, in the presence of a judge, and right there in court to tell a lie. That is called committing perjury. Now, the verbal form is to say, you have perjured yourself. One doesn't say you have perjured. One says you have perjured yourself. It's a reflexive verb. It's a verb that never takes any object other than the reflexive. So I perjure myself, you perjure yourself, he perjures himself, she perjures herself. These reflexive verbs, you can see, in their lexical entry, have the specification, I'm a reflexive verb, I must take a reflexive object. That shows you that a reflexive has something to do with the verbal complex of the sentence. Some element in the verbal complex keeps tabs on whether the sentence has the right structure, whether the verb has managed to get the reflexive object that it requested. Now, the verbal item under V cannot really do this. The verb delegates all its work of keeping tabs on the peripheral items in the verbal context, the auxiliaries. So we shall assume, and in some languages there is good reason to assume, that a peripheral part of the verbal complex, a special element there, which in our theory is a volatile element, an element that you cannot see at the surface structure level, keeps check on the rest of the sentence to make sure that a verb that has requested a reflexive gets it. So a sentence like Shyam will perjure himself has the structure Shyam will special element perjure himself, and that special element is volatile, it is in the verbal complex, and its task is to look out and find a reflexive and say that I'm happy if it finds the reflexive. We will call this special element X aux, X because it is volatile and aux because it belongs to the auxiliary system. We don't need any content for it because we will get rid of it anyway. But we need to make sure that X aux has the same referential index as the reflexive. In addition, we have to make sure that X aux has the same referential index as the noun phrase, which is the antecedent for that anaphor, for that reflexive. So in a sentence like Shyam will perjure himself, the full structure at the deep structure level is Shyam subscript I for the referential index, will, X aux has a subscript I, which makes it co-referential with Shyam, perjure, followed by himself. At the deep structure level, himself hasn't yet worked on its subscript, but when you go through the derivations, you will see that the subscript of himself is also extremely important. So X aux, Shyam, and himself have to share a common index, which we write as I conventionally. I stands for an integer of some kind, 1, 2, 3, 4. But since it doesn't matter what integer you pick, in these lessons we have been writing I, as in most linguistics textbooks. Likewise, in a sentence like suit yourself in the imperative, adding earlier learning to what you have now learnt in this module, the deep structure of suit yourself is XU, remember that XU is volatile and will be deleted. X will, remember that X will is the special auxiliary for the imperative, which is also volatile. X aux, which has been introduced this time with that special I. Suit yourself. You will have to end up making sure that X aux is co-indexed with XU and with yourself. Of course, there are senses of suit in which suit doesn't take a reflexive, but as you know, suit yourself is a fixed expression. It means do what you like. I don't care, suit yourself. In that fixed expression, suit becomes a reflexive verb. You don't have sentences like suit me, suit your friends. You don't say that, you say suit yourself. Once you have created X aux for reflexive verbs, it makes sense to also keep it for other verbs which happen to take a reflexive that drops by in the sentence, like a visitor. If you have a sentence like Ali will shave himself, you therefore want to say Ali is co-indexed with X aux, and both of them are co-indexed with himself in Ali will X aux shave himself. While you're co-indexing, it is important to understand that X aux sharing an index with the subject cannot act alone. If one auxiliary in a verbal complex is co-indexed with the subject, all the auxiliaries in the verbal complex have to be co-indexed with the subject. So if you have a sentence like, Ali may have been shaving himself, that verbal complex has several auxiliaries, may, have, been, and X aux. If X aux is co-indexed with Ali, may and have and been are also co-indexed with Ali. Remember, auxiliaries share the index of the lexical item they're associated with, in this case the verb. Auxiliaries cannot have different indices from each other. Here we are not interested in whether the verb has the same index, but if we were, we'd end up saying yes it does. That simply is not at the center of the teaching in this module. But if you want to have a gun at our head and ask us, does the verb carry the same index? Yes, it does, but we're not going to deal with the verb's index. We are merely informing you that all the auxiliaries have the same index. This is also the case not only for reflexives, but for another type of anaphor. It is also the case for bound anaphors. So in an expression like, Mary may crane her neck, where craning her neck is one of those constructions that require bound anaphora, we shall postulate ex ox in the deep structure. Therefore, the deep structure of Mary may crane her neck is Mary subscript I, may subscript I, ex ox subscript I, crane her subscript I, neck. Notice that neck doesn't have the same index because Mary and neck are different entities. The neck is not all of Mary. It is not Mary's body and soul together rolled into one self. A neck is one part of the body, right? So Mary has one index, neck has another. Neck is not co-indexed with Mary. But Mary is co-indexed with the ex ox and with her in her neck. Her is a bound anaphor. It takes Mary as its antecedent. Now we are ready, since we have looked at ex ox in the role of helping reflexives or bound anaphors to find their bearings in the sentence, we are ready to make a statement. For our convenience of statement, we shall use a term that is not common in the linguistics literature, the term primary anaphor. We shall call reflexives and bound anaphors primary anaphor and set up a transformation that we shall call primary anaphor licensing. This is going to make sure that primary anaphors are connected properly with their neighborhood. The way we state it is a transformation with the structural description starting with the noun phrase in question, the noun phrase that does the binding, the antecedent, followed by some auxiliary. There usually is an auxiliary in the verbal complex other than ex ox, followed by ex ox. Then we put in an optional factor with the feature plus BA. BA is short for bound anaphora. That optional factor comes into play when we apply the statement to sentences like Sally craned her neck, where bound anaphora actually occurs. It does not come into play in sentences with ordinary reflexives coming into the sentence, such as John shaved himself this morning, where there is no requirement for there to be either a reflexive or a bound anaphor. There is no bound anaphora trigger in such a sentence. So the bound anaphora trigger is optional here. It is optional because only in some of the cases are we going to get it. Notice that there are two types of bound anaphora trigger. First, the type that you get in bound anaphora constructions like John lost his way, Mary craned her neck, and so on. Sally lost her temper. Those are bound anaphora constructions. Secondly, when there is a reflexive verb like perjure himself or suit yourself. Reflexive verbs are also bound anaphora triggers in the sense in which we are using the term. They force there to be an anaphor. That makes them triggers. Following that optional bound anaphora trigger, we have a variable because there's other stuff in the sentence usually. Then there is the NP that is going to be co-indexed with this, NP sub I, and then Y. You've got 7 factors in total. Now in this structure, our task is to make sure that the third factor, the ex ox, having done its work, disappears. So the output is very simple, 1, 2, 0, 4, 5, 6, 7. The third factor, which is the ex ox, which must disappear before surface structure, disappears at this point. What does it do? What is the purpose of having a primary anaphor licensing rule that deletes the ex ox factor? The task of ex ox is to make sure that there are 2 co-referential NPs in the right positions. We could put in further details into the structural description to make sure that it is the second NP that is the bound anaphor or reflexive, and it's the first NP that is a full noun phrase. But as the module unfolds, you will gradually see that there is no need to do that. There is no way for the anaphor to come first in an English type language and the antecedent to come second. There is now a technical difficulty. What happens if you have got the wrong kind of sentence and X ox does not match its neighborhood? Consider a sentence like John will shave himself, where John and himself have the same index I, but X ox has not been inserted. Remember that X ox gets inserted by a lexical insertion process. Lexical insertion processes apply freely. They cannot see their surroundings. Therefore, in the verbal complex, you may have failed to insert X ox. And you may have John and himself in the sentence. Everything may be fine, except that X ox is missing. Under these conditions, what is going to happen to that sentence, John will shave himself, where X ox is not present, is that our transformation will not apply. The primary anaphor himself will not get licensed by the special element X ox. And the result is the indices are going to survive until surface structure. Now, what we have said so far in the preceding modules does not make that a problem. We have to turn that into a problem, because otherwise we have no way to prevent John, I, will shave himself, I, from being generated as a surface structure. Thus, we have no way to enforce the application of the licensing transformation that we just formulated. We have no way to make sure that X ox is present whenever its supervisory role is called for. We therefore introduce a new convention that we call the index removal convention. The index removal convention says when a transformation has done its work, the indices associated with that work are removed. We have to tweak the convention in such a way that the licensing transformation we have just formulated qualifies for index removal. And a sentence like John will shave himself without the X ox and therefore not undergoing this transformation does not qualify for index removal. Therefore, inappropriately, it will keep its index until surface structure and the derivation is going to collapse. That is the result we want. We want the derivation without X ox to collapse. We only want the derivation where X ox is present to succeed. This is a preliminary formulation of index removal, but you get the general idea. In one of the subsequent modules, we will have to tweak it for other reasons that have to do with much more complex sentences. So please bear with us and do not take the formulation of index removal given in this module as the final word in this course. There is an important difference about all these matters between English and Hindi. So far, we have not said much about what can be an antecedent and what cannot be an antecedent. We have given you an exercise where you get a chance to find out for yourself that the difference between English and Hindi Urdu is that in English and Hindi you can say Rita cooks for others, not for herself, where herself takes the antecedent Rita, which is the subject of the sentence. English also allows Shyam showed Rita a picture of herself, where Rita is the antecedent for the anaphor herself. Rita is an object here, and Shyam showed Rita a picture of herself. In Hindi, this is not permitted. You cannot in Hindi say Shyam ne Rita ko apni tasveer dikhai and mean Rita ki tasveer. The meaning of Shyam ne Rita ko apni tasveer dikhai has to be Shyam ki tasveer. So the English sentence Shyam showed Rita a picture of herself cannot be literally translated into Hindi Urdu with apni for herself. We ask you in the exercise to work out the details of the difference between English and Hindi. You will find on the whole that Hindi reflexives always take subject antecedents, whereas English reflexives can take both subjects and non-subjects as antecedents. Now we want to expand our analysis to cover personal pronouns like I, you, he, she, it, they. We have so far been talking about 2 of the 3 classes of anaphors. In the early days of generative syntax, grammarians thought that the way to analyze pronouns perhaps is like the way to analyze anaphors. Just as for anaphors, you have to find where they can be anaphoric to which antecedent. People imagine that also for pronouns, it's a good idea to look at the same linkage between a pronoun and some antecedent that it is anaphoric to. And they tried to draw a map of the sentence with this question in mind. The results were very frustrating. It turned out that that approach to the way pronouns interact with other noun phrases in the sentence is not actually very helpful. On the way to the correct answer to that question, in fact, on the way to the correct question that one has to deal with, generative syntax discovered a few other geometrical properties of the tree that need to be understood to draw the picture correctly. We will now introduce these geometrical properties. They are expressed by the technical terms C command, the letter C hyphen command, and circle. C command is a relation between 2 nodes in a syntactic tree such that X C commands Y if when you go up from X to the first branching node and then come down and look around to see if you can find Y, if you do find Y. Thus, for example, if you say John will shave himself, you've got a sentence, then you have a noun phrase, John, and you have a verb phrase, will shave himself. So John C commands himself because from the NP John, when you look up, you get S, which is the first branching node above NP. And when you look down, you find himself. Himself is dominated by S. That is C command. In contrast, if you say John's mother will shave himself, which is ungrammatical, the tree of John's mother will shave himself looks like this. You've got S, then you've got the subject NP, under which you've got another NP John and an N mother. And outside this NP, you've got the VP will shave himself. Now, the difficulty here is the NP that needs to C command himself, which is John. When you look up from that NP, the first branching node above it is not the S, which is what you want. The first branching node is the other NP. There are 2 NPs there, right? The bigger NP, which is at the top, is John's mother, and the smaller NP, which is its daughter, is John. So you've got NP dominating NPN, John's mother. And John C commands mother, but John doesn't C command himself, because the first branching node overhead John is John's mother rather than the full sentence. That is a failure of C command between John and himself. John's mother C commands himself, but that's useless because John's mother cannot be the antecedent for himself. John's mother is a feminine noun phrase and himself is a masculine noun phrase. That's about C command. Now we have to introduce the technical term circle. C command needs to be checked within a circle. At a first approximation, you can say that a circle is more or less the S, what you find within a particular S, a particular clause. We have so far shown you an example where there is only one clause involved. But if you have 2 clauses, for example, if you say, John hopes that these people will shave himself. Why does that sentence fail? Why can't John be the antecedent for himself and John hopes that these people will shave himself? Because here is one S, John hopes that, and then you start another S, these people will shave himself. Yes, John C commands himself, but the difficulty is when you go up from John and come down, you encounter the boundary of another S. That's a different circle. So himself is in one circle, John is in another circle. The result is that even though John secomands himself, and John hopes that these people will shave himself, nonetheless, John cannot be the antecedent for himself because they're in two different circles. This is roughly the kind of geometry that is required to make sense of the relation between anaphors and their antecedents. It turns out that the same logic is relevant to understanding what kinds of index sharing or non-sharing can happen between personal pronouns and their antecedents or non-antecedents, other NPs. If you take a sentence like, John hopes that these people will shave him. Him can mean John. It is not possible, though himself cannot mean John in that sentence. But him can also mean somebody else. It can mean David. It can mean some other man. So the main point turns out not to be that him can mean John. The main point turns out to be that him is free to choose whatever reference it wants. With personal pronouns that are not anaphors, third person personal pronouns, because those are the most interesting grammatically, since first and second person pronouns have fixed reference. Third person personal pronouns like he, she, it, they are capable of freely choosing their referential index and choosing whether they will be co-indexed with something else or whether they will be contra-indexed. Contra-indexed is the opposite of co-indexed, whether they will have a different index from something else. Now, as we've been trying to explain to you, the main question about a pronoun is not what is it co-indexed with. The main question is what is it contra-indexed with. The answer to that is a pronoun is arrogant. It is contra-indexed with all other NPs in its circle. It's a bit like somebody who is so arrogant that they don't make any friends in their immediate neighborhood. They make friends far away. In their neighborhood, they go up with their nose turned up and they go around, not making friends, pushing everybody away. A pronoun is like that. It doesn't want any co-indexing inside its circle. So if you have a sentence like, John shaved him, him and John have to be different people. Why? Because him is a pronoun. It's a pronominal. Pronominal is the technical term in generative syntax for those pronouns which are not anaphors. A pronominal is contra-indexed with everything in its circle. So in the circle, John shaved him must be contra-indexed with John. Outside the circle, for example, John hopes that these people will shave him. Him can make friends with John. It can have the same index as John. Why? Because it is arrogant within its circle. It is not arrogant outside the circle. That is the whole point of the principle of arrogance. This is a metaphor we are using. We are hoping it will help you to remember how pronouns decide over which range they're going to be contra-indexed. But the technical formulations come pretty close to this idea of arrogance. We'll introduce a second metaphor of this kind to tell you another important property of pronominals. That second metaphor is best illustrated by taking a sentence like, he said that I said that you said that John was going to be late for work. In a sentence like that, where you have lots of S boundaries, first S, he said, second S, that I said, third S, that you said, fourth S, that John is going to be late for work. However many sentence boundaries you introduce in this huge structure, if there is a he secommanding down all the way, if it is the subject of the top S in such a structure, and if there is some other noun phrase down there like John, which wants to be co-indexed with he is going to be very nervous. It will say, no, I don't want to make friends with that character. Now, if I do this in terms of friendship, you won't be able to remember. So I've chosen a metaphor based on a story that you must have heard. It's about the princess and the pea. Once upon a time, as you must have heard, there was this king who was looking for such a princess that she would really be worthy to marry his son. And he sent out word giving the description of the kind of princess he wants. He wanted somebody who is extremely sensitive, who is more sensitive than any other princess competing for the job of marrying his son. Finally, he found a girl. She was a princess who was so sensitive that if you told her to sleep and under her mattress you planted a pea, that pea would give her so much pain that she couldn't sleep all night. And this happened even if you put 20 mattresses under her, and even if the pea was at the bottom of that pile of 20 mattresses, she was still able to feel the pea through the 20 mattresses. So I'm using that metaphor to explain that in a structure like this, he said, that I said, that you said, that John is going to be late for work. He and John cannot be the same because he is your princess and John is the pea. So even at the bottom of a huge pile of mattresses, he can sense the presence of an NP trying to be co-indexed with it, which it C-commands. And he will say, no, I C-command this NP, so I refuse to be co-indexed with it. I'm a princess and that NP is my P. So you've got two principles concerning the co-indexing properties of a pronoun. A pronoun must be contra-indexed with every noun phrase in its circle. And outside the circle, the princess and the P applies. If the pronoun C-commands some noun phrase outside its circle, however far away that noun phrase might be, the pronoun must be contra-indexed with that noun phrase, even if it is 5 sentences away. These are the two principles governing the behavior of pronominals. The pronouns I've been talking about here are pronominals in the technical sense of generative syntax, by which I mean that they are part-time anaphors. They are not full-time anaphors. We use the term anaphor in generative syntax for those pronouns which must be anaphoric all the time. We use the term pronominal for those pronouns which are anaphoric part of the time. When we study pronominals, we are mainly concerned with cases where they are not anaphoric, where they don't share their index, where they are contra-indexed. That is the basis of deciding when a pronominal is behaving properly, when its indexing properties are going to be accepted and the sentence will come up well formed. Before we leave the topic, we need to make a slight revision in the definition of circle and announce that there will be more definitions, more revisions in your advanced syntax course. We have told you as a rough and ready initial approximation that a circle can be thought of as being an S. Is it within your S or is it across an S boundary that makes something be within your circle or outside your circle? Now it turns out sometimes the circle is the NP rather than the S. So if you compare the sentence we give as 13 in the e-text, nobody is worried about the teenage boy's problems with himself. The circle within which himself looks for an antecedent is the NP, and himself is quite satisfied to find the teenage boy within the circle, so that you can say the teenage boy's problems with himself, meaning the teenage boy's problems with the teenage boy. If you look outside that circle, it is going too far. You can prove that by looking at sentence 14, which is bad. The teenage boy is ignoring Mary's problems with himself. This is a bad sentence because here, in Mary's problems with himself, the noun phrase that counts as the circle relevant to himself has failed to find an antecedent. It looks for an antecedent way up there in the S. The teenage boy is ignoring Mary's problems with himself. So from examples like these, it can be shown that in certain constructions, it is not the S but the NP that counts as a circle. We are making this correction not as part of an exercise we're going to do in this particular paper. In the morphology and syntax paper, which is elementary, we will not give you a final definition of the concept of circle. When you're ready for the final definition in the advanced syntax course, you will learn that people use other kinds of technical terms for it. They don't call it a circle. We are using the term circle the way we are talking about arrogance and the way we are talking about the princess and the pea. Circle is a rough and ready initial term. We are carefully avoiding giving you the actual technical terms, domain, governing category, and so on, because those terms come with their accurate definitions attached, and you have not learned the architecture necessary for those accurate definitions. So we are leaving you with this rough definition of circle and telling you that these definitions do not work in detail. If you want them to work, you have to go up to advanced syntax. At the same time, we want to leave you with a sense of the geometry that tells anaphors and pronominals where the anaphors have to be co-indexed and where the pronominals have to be contra-indexed. That is the reason why we have introduced C command and circle in the elementary syntax course, contrary to the habits of most of the syntax courses that you will find in your further reading. We had told you that there are three subclasses of anaphors: reflexives, reciprocals, and bound anaphors. Our discussion of anaphors in the first section of this module was only about reflexives and bound anaphors. We had purposely postponed the discussion of reciprocals. Why had we postponed the discussion of reciprocals? They are particularly complicated because one element of the reciprocal is a quantifier. If you have each other, the quantifier element is each. If you have one another, the quantifier element is one. Then there are some languages in which the structure of a reciprocal is a repetition of the word for other. For example, in Sanskrit, you get paras, param, where paras means other and param means other again. You have similar structures for reciprocals in Dravidian languages, such as Kannada and so on. Because of this complex structure, the analysis of reciprocals is one step harder. In the early days of generative syntactic research, it was believed that reciprocals are formed by the quantifier moving into another position. That, for example, the deep structure of the men like each other was each of the men like the others. And then there is an each movement transformation which takes the each and moves each into the position of the. So each of the men like the others turns into the men like each other. This was the initial idea. Later it turned out that that is not really the way to do things, because sometimes you get other quantifiers in the deep structure and each clashes with them. If you want to say all the men like each other, the deep structure for that surely cannot be each of all the men likes the others. That is not a possible sentence. Therefore, people realized that the each movement analysis is not the best way to handle reciprocals. They began to generate reciprocals forms in the deep structure itself. That is called the base generation hypothesis. And they began to interpret reciprocals where they are located. In order to handle reciprocals, just as reflexives require a special element in the auxiliary complex, X-aux, likewise reciprocals also have the same requirement. The evidence on which we base this idea comes from languages such as French and certain Dravidian languages in which there is an anaphora tracking element in the verbal complex. In French, it looks like a reflexive clitic. In the Dravidian languages, it is a particular auxiliary element in the verbal complex itself. That element is present both with reflexives and with reciprocals. On the strength of the overt evidence in French and in Dravidian languages, we conclude that universally, in all the languages that have reflexives and reciprocals, it is necessary to keep a tracking element in the auxiliary system of the verbal complex, which watches to see that the reflexive or reciprocal is properly tied together with its antecedent. So we follow that strategy for reciprocals also, just as we follow it for reflexives. We now turn to the behavior of names. This is another area of difference between English-type languages and Indian languages. In English-type languages, if you repeat a name, everybody assumes that you mean two different people. In English, if you say, John is talking to John's sister, the listener assumes that there are two different people there called John, and John A is talking to John B's sister. If you want to say the same person is talking to the same person's sister, you say John is talking to his sister. You don't say John is talking to John's sister. But in an Indian language like Hindi Urdu, if you say Ramesh ne Ramesh ki behan se baat ki, it is perfectly possible to take that to mean that the same Ramesh is talking to his own sister, not to some other Ramesh's sister. This shows that Indian languages permit the repetition of a name without contra-indexing, whereas languages like English and French and German do not permit this. How do we handle this behavior in a syntactic analysis where we are concerned with index sharing, with whether two noun phrases have the same index or different indices? Obviously, we need to look more carefully at the properties of name repetition in Indian languages. If I slap myself, you cannot say in an Indian language, Ramesh slapped Ramesh. That is ungrammatical. In other words, a repeated name does not have the same behavior as a reflexive. But you can say, Ramesh ne Ramesh ki behan se baat ki. Ramesh talked to Ramesh's sister, with co-indexing between the two occurrences of Ramesh. That suggests that it is to be compared with a pronominal. A repeated name occurs in those positions where a pronominal can occur. It does not occur in those positions where you expect a reflexive. One way to handle this is to say that in Indian languages, a pronominal can take the shape of a name. So I suggest that we call them name-shaped pronominals. This then is a property of those Indian languages where this can happen. We give you an exercise where you are encouraged to find out for yourself whether this fact holds only of names like Ramesh and Deepa and so on, or whether it also holds of definite descriptions, whether it holds of phrases like the Prime Minister's Secretary, Pradhan Mantri Ji ke Sachiv, whether definite descriptions have the same properties as names as far as repetition and co-indexing are concerned. We are not going to do the exercise for you, so we will not tell you the answer to that question. You will find out for yourself. It is time now to summarize how much got done in this module. The module is concerned with pronouns and anaphors, and it was at pains to distinguish those pronouns that are always anaphoric, that are therefore called anaphors, and those pronouns that are not always anaphoric and are therefore in certain technical registers called pronominals, to distinguish them from pronouns in general. We began by giving you the traditional classification of pronouns into several types: personal, demonstrative, interrogative, relative, reflexive, reciprocal. And then we pulled out a few of these subclasses for special discussion in this module. This module said nothing about interrogatives and relatives, for example. That is left for much later. We pulled out those types of pronoun which are always anaphoric, in other words, which always require an antecedent in the same circle. Initially, we were saying in the same sentence. Gradually, we introduced the term circle to help you to get your bearings in the larger sentences. And it turned out on closer examination that anaphors, which are of three types, reflexives, reciprocals, and what are called bound anaphors, go around looking for an antecedent in their circle, an antecedent that C commands them, and that pronominals, in contrast, are arrogant. In their circle, they only want to be contra-indexed with everything else. Outside their circle, a pronominal exhibits princess and P behavior. So if a pronominal is way up there and if it C commands a P, in other words, another noun phrase, however far down it may be in the structure, across 2, 3, or 4 circle boundaries, the pronominal resolutely prevents co-indexing with that P. That is the princess and the P principle. These are the principles that guide us through the behavior of pronominals. In order to keep tabs on reflexives, bound anaphors, and reciprocals and make sure that they secure the connection they want with their antecedent inside their circle, we made sure that the transformation responsible for this, called primary anaphor licensing, we reserve the term secondary anaphor for reciprocals, introduces an extra element, a volatile element in the auxiliary system that we called X-aux, X for volatile and aux for membership of the auxiliary system, which is co-indexed with the anaphor and with its antecedent, and whose job is to make sure that the anaphor and the antecedent find each other. We first set this up for reflexives and bound anaphors, which are primary anaphors. And in a later section of our discussion, we noted that the same strategy works very well for reciprocals, and we gave reasons for doing it that way. In contrast to anaphors, where co-indexing is the kind of index sharing that is involved, the main point of the grammar of pronominals is that they mainly look for contra-indexing. They're not interested in who they can share an index with. They're interested in who they do not share an index with, who they differ from. This is what we expressed with the metaphors of arrogance and the princess and the P. This concludes our discussion of pronouns and anaphors in generative syntax. We encourage you to look at the e-text that presents some of the details with more technical accuracy. We also want you to look at the further readings that are recommended in the e-text and to get back to us for any clarifications you might need. Thank you for your attention.